presented live on our YouTube channel at this time. I'm Dr. Aubrey Zidenberg, a volunteer with B'nai Brith for over 30 years, Vice President of B'nai Brith International for Canada, and founder and national chair of the Special Advisory Council to the League for Human Rights and the B'nai Brith Police Liaison. B'nai Brith is the oldest Jewish human rights organization in the world, operating since 1843 and in Canada since 1875. These events are part of a series done in conjunction with our League for Human Rights, which is comprised of over 35 committed liaisons to the diverse multicultural communities, the collective minorities that are the new majority and reflective of the new face of Canada. This advisory council, now in its 22nd year, brings together diverse community leaders under the umbrella of B'nai Brith in an unbreakable friendship as friends of the family we choose for ourselves. Over the last 11 years, I have also had the good fortune to be the co-chair with the head of intelligence and organized crime of the York Regional Police Chiefs Community Advisory Council, ISCAC, the Integrated Strategic Community Advisory Council. For those of you who are new to our monthly fireside chat, let me tell you of some of the impressive guests that we have had in the past who have given us updates and insight into issues that impact our daily lives. They have included Jason Kenney, journalist Diane Francis, CIBC World President Victor Dodick, Pierre Poilievre, the police chiefs from both Toronto and York Region, former Education Minister Stephen Lecce, Ontario Solicitor General Michael Kerzner, retired Canadian Senator Jerry Grafstein, the Consul General of Israel, Melissa Lantzman, journalist Warren Kinsella, and we had the good fortune to have Richard Heidemann, the former world president of B'nai Brith International and the American Zionist Association, as well as Majid Al-Shafi of One Free World International, Raheel Raza, a Muslim activist, and Phyllis Heidemann Greenberg, the current president of the March of the Living and past president of the Holocaust Memorial Museum in Washington. Our last guest was Toronto Police Deputy Chief over Operational Command, Rob Johnson. Our format this evening will be a 40-minute fireside chat with Ontario Provincial Police Commissioner Tom Carrique that will be hosted by Rich Robertson, our Director of Research and Advocacy at B'nai Brith Canada, followed by 15 minutes of Q&A with our Zoom guests. All guests will be muted tonight, so once we begin, you must send your questions in through the Zoom chat. Rich will monitor your questions and determine which ones will be asked of our special guests. Tom Carrique became the 15th Commissioner of the Ontario Provincial Police April 8, 2019. Commissioner Carrique commenced his policing career with the York Regional Police in 1990. He progressed through the ranks and served as Deputy Chief of the Administration Branch, Operations Branch, Investigations, and Support Branch. Commissioner Carrique holds a master's degree in leadership and training with a specialty in justice and public safety from Royal Roads University and a certificate of terrorism studies from the University of St. Andrews in Scotland. He is currently elected as president of the Canadian Association of Chiefs of Police, and he serves as a co-chair of the Criminal Intelligence Services Canada National Executive Committee and is on the board of directors of the Ontario Association of Chiefs of Police. He is an appointed member of the International Association of Chiefs of Police, Division of State and Provincial Police Executive Committee. In addition, he is also a member of the Ministry of the Solicitor General, Executive Mental Health and Steering Committee. Commissioner Carrique is a very decorated senior officer with 34 years of devoted service to the citizens of Canada and is the recipient of the Police Exemplary Service Medal and the Queen Elizabeth II Diamond Jubilee Medal. Ladies and gentlemen, I'm now going to turn it over to our host, Rich Robertson, who is going to host the balance of this evening with Commissioner Carrique. Thank you.
Thank you, Aubrey, for those generous and thorough introductions. Before we start, Commissioner Carrique, on behalf of our entire audience, I just wanted to thank you so much for joining us tonight. And also one order of housekeeping. Those in the Zoom chat, if you could please direct any questions directly to me through the chat. That's the best way to get my attention, and I will do my best to cover all the questions that I receive. You know, Commissioner, before we get into some of the meatier questions, let's say, I always like to start with a little bit of background. Could you maybe tell our audience how you got into policing, what inspired you to become an officer?
Yeah, absolutely, I can. And my good friend Aubrey, I know, has heard this story before, so please bear with me, Dr. Zidenberg. As a young boy, my dad was a member of the Toronto Police Auxiliary Unit. And it wasn't until I was about 11 years old that I realized he actually had a paying job. He was a business owner because he spent so much of his time volunteering with the Toronto Auxiliary. I thought that's what he actually did for a living. So my inspiration to become a police officer and give back to community and protect the most vulnerable in our communities clearly came from the example that he set for me.
Well, and we're certainly glad that you chose to follow in his footsteps, Commissioner. And so the topic for tonight's discussion is from the classroom to the city streets, the new pipeline of hate. And obviously, the last year and a bit in Canada has been a divisive time. Of course, in the jurisdiction that you oversee, there's been a rise in protests, a rise in hate-motivated occurrences and offenses. So I think that there's lots for us to discuss. I'd like to start by maybe, since public demonstrations have been such a hot topic over the last little while, maybe we could start by talking about your opinion on how public demonstrations have evolved over the past few years. I mean, you've been in policing for 34 years, so I'm sure you've seen lots of changes.
Well, they certainly have changed. You know, they are a lot more multifaceted now and interconnected than they have ever been, a lot more responsive to global issues. We've always seen demonstrations on Canadian soil that are connected to global issues, but the information of global conflict, of injustices that happen around the world, like the Hamas terrorist attack of October the 7th, instantly are delivered to in images, in misinformation and disinformation around the globe. And this causes reaction in local communities. Certainly an evolution of demonstration tactics we have seen over the course of the last 5 years has been not only the maintenance of large-scale demonstration, but smaller groups gathering in multiple locations. There have been days in this province where we have had close to 30 demonstrations happening at one time across multiple jurisdictions, all interconnected on similar issues and or finding energy from each other on issues that have no connectivity other than the intention of causing civil unrest and demonstrating and expressing their views.
And when you talk about connectivity, I imagine that a lot of the connectivity is occurring online. So maybe you could discuss with us about how maybe social media has influenced the organization and reach of protests.
Absolutely. Thank you for that. You know, social media has been the greatest influencer. Back in the day when I was a member of Public Order Unit in York and stood on the line at many protests and demonstrations, many of the people that participated in those protests were recruited by word of mouth. They were recruited by flyers that would be posted on light standards and telephone posts. They would be recruited from classrooms, where today there's global reach using social media, being able to get the message out, be able to plan protests, being able to communicate. Social media has totally changed the game, and it has dramatically increased the sphere of influence, the coordination, and the communication of those that plan and participate in demonstrations.
Are there any specific platforms that are causing trouble for the police, or that you find are, instigating some of these protests, or that are just making it more difficult for you to monitor what's going on in regards to these protest movements?
There's a wide variety of platforms that both present challenges for us, but also opportunities. There's a lot of open source dialogue that takes place on social media, which can give us a view in to some of the emotions and some of the intentions of some of the groups. Social media platforms like Instagram and X use algorithms, so information can find their way to individuals. And if that is misinformation or disinformation, that can continue to perpetuate thoughts and bring people like-minded together of ill intentions. So that obviously creates a challenge for us. There are apps available very easily to any user of a smartphone that provide encrypted end-to-end communication, which means some of the communication, some of the dialogue is not accessible to the police in an open source format. So that can always be a challenge for us. The rapid rate at which information can be exchanged, misinformation can be received, recruiting efforts can be undertaken by groups who want to propagate hate material or even extremist groups. These things all cause a challenge for policing.
And obviously, this is impacting how, the next generation of Canadians, the youth, receive information, and you were talking before about how a lot of when you first started, information was shared hand to hand or by word of mouth. How are you seeing youth engaging with content, maybe problematic content, as a result of, what you described as, the diverse array of social media platforms that they have access to?
So there's what we see and then there's what we don't see, which caused equal amount of concerns for us. And what we don't see are the things that should be most concerning. We do see youth getting attracted to propaganda from terrorist organizations who use social media to try to inspire radical thoughts and extremist behaviors. There is a lot of influence that is generated over the social media platforms that are available to these nefarious groups and or individuals. They can cause for individual actors to carry out or plan intentions to cause communities harm. And that can be extremely difficult to find that needle in a haystack. That is one of the biggest challenges that we currently face.
And I mean, you have a learned expertise as well in global terrorism. So I guess my follow-up question to your response is, would you say that there's more nefarious information out there, or is it just more accessible? Do you think that we have a growing extremism problem, or do we have to deal with that as well, or is it just that this information is more available to youth and to others than it was in the past?
That's a great question, and I think it comes and goes, and it ebbs and flows. And there's been times in our history where we have seen the devastating effects of terrorist groups, and we continue to see that today. So it is nothing new, unfortunately. The concerning part is the greater reach that these groups have through these social media platforms and the access to information and being able to inspire lone actors and not having to bring people together to cultivate them, to inspire them, and to compel them to act. This can all be done through keyboards on a platform or platforms that are essentially autonomous. There's no oversight. There's no obligations to provide access. And this creates essentially an area and a space where these terrorist entities, these extremists, these individual criminals can grow and flourish.
And as the commissioner of a large force, how do you, what do you have, what are you doing to stay ahead of rapidly changing technology? I'm sure that it's an incredibly challenging endeavor to do so, but maybe you could discuss with our audience, some of the ways in which you're able to adapt.
Yes, there's certain components that are appropriate to discuss this evening, and one is obviously being alive to those open source information channels for which information is freely exchanged, and it can inform us as to what the thoughts of individuals and groups are, what the planned activities are. It enables us to then to try to make personal connections. And, despite the advent of technology and the amount of information that is available and exchanged, we still rely on heavily on trying to build relationships with individuals who may pose a risk, to get them to connected to individuals or groups that can assist them in changing their thoughts and their ideas, building relationships with religious organizations, religious leaders, speaking to community and having them alert us of any concerning behaviors, whether it's a parent, whether it's a teacher, whether it's a religious leader, whether it's somebody that sits in a congregation with somebody, and ensuring that we have ongoing dialogue with those that are lawfully engaged in demonstrations, because these lawful demonstrations can be infiltrated by people with ill intentions. So making sure that we are living up to our obligation under the Canadian Charter of Rights and freedom of expression, freedom of lawful and peaceful assembly, and facilitating these events where we can and when we can in a lawful manner, and having the relationships with the organizers where they too can alert us to individuals that pose or groups that pose a concern, for them being able to maintain the lawfulness of a demonstration.
And that actually segues into something else I was hoping to discuss with you. What are some, because I think a lot of people, have questions about, what sort of there is a threshold between lawful and unlawful when it comes to these demonstrations. So could you discuss with us maybe some of the indicators that law enforcement use when trying to identify when a demonstration has the capacity to or does in fact become a public safety risk?
Yes, so it starts long before the demonstration where we have the opportunity to do so. Identifying any known parties that are going to be demonstrating within the group that may pose a risk or a safety concern, and being able to engage with demonstration organizers to ensure there's rules of engagement as these demonstrations are being planned. One of the most successful avenues that we have of maintaining a peaceful demonstration is ensuring people know the law and that the organizers set up rules of engagement. So that is obviously one of the first and foremost things that we do. We monitor the emotions as best we can. We look for indicators of agitators within a crowd and within a group. And obviously, we are very focused on any hate speech that is directed towards any identifiable group. These are all things that we are constantly monitoring, and we have to adapt and respond accordingly.
In that sense, just so to circle back to the social media very quickly, because this other question popped into my head when we were discussing online forums. How are the police able to use social media to your advantage, as a tool to educate the public and to interact with the public? If you could comment on that, perhaps.
Yes, absolutely, and great question, and thank you for leading me in on it with some many very good examples of police services that are communicating about planned demonstrations that they're aware of, to reemphasize what the law is, what the expected behaviors are, and what the consequences are of not abiding by those expected behaviors. Toronto Police has done a tremendous job of that over the last year and a half. Peel Regional Police has done an outstanding job of this as well. And as we saw the Freedom Convoy come to conclusion, Ottawa Police Service did an excellent job of every step of the way notifying the community through traditional and social media as to what they could expect from the police and what would be tolerated as enforcement actions started to take place at the conclusion of the Freedom Convoy.
Yes, and we at B'nai Brith have, been grateful for a lot of the dialogue that's being disseminated. It allows us, to make the public aware of things that are happening. So I wanted to make sure that we touched on the fact that yes, social media can be an obstacle, but also it can be used as a positive tool for our law enforcement agencies across the province. We're talking about, from the classroom to the city streets, and there's been a lot of discussion across Canada recently about how perhaps ideologies or Yeah, well, we use the term ideologies from outside of Canada or influencing things that are happening inside of Canada. I know that you play a role amongst our national chiefs of police apparatus, and maybe you can touch on how what you're seeing in terms of foreign interference or foreign entities influencing some of the unrest that we've been seeing recently.
Yes, foreign interference is certainly not within the scope of the provincial police. These are items of national
Mhm,
security in some cases and come under the mandate of CSIS and the RCMP.
mhm,
But we all know that what happens around the globe
mhm,
influences what happens in our very multicultural society
mhm.
here in Canada. And it would be naive of us not to recognize that outside foreign actors do have the ability to influence demonstrations, try to influence policy by virtue of what we see playing itself out in our local communities.
Would you say then that our globalizing, and our technologically fluid world has forced you as the commissioner to adapt in terms of the cooperation that you have with our federal agencies and with other local agencies across the country?
I'm not sure if it's caused us to adapt as much as it has really strengthened those relationships in terms of ensuring that there is constant communication. And I can share with you a few, very real examples. The fact that the commissioner of the RCMP hosts bi-weekly hate crime meetings with all of the major police services across Canada to discuss what's happening in local communities. What are the trends in hate crimes? What are any significant incidents that other police services should be aware of? What have been successful investigative tactics and techniques as it relates to hate crime investigations and maintaining lawful demonstrations? That is a cadence that we have never seen before and reflective of the great relationships and collaboration that's taking place between municipal, provincial, and our national police service. We here in the province of Ontario have established what we call our public order hub. So there are 10 public order teams in the province of Ontario, and we all sit and analyze where the demands for service are so we can prioritize collectively where those public order teams need to be when, based on what's known and the risk associated to what's known. And in times of extreme challenge, again, like the Freedom Convoy, we were able to dispatch teams from as far, public order personnel from as far away as Vancouver and everywhere in between to come to Ontario to assist with the enforcement portion of the plan that was eventually executed in Ottawa to bring calm and order back to our nation's capital. We also have, through the RCMP, connection to what's called the Five Eyes, the five countries around the world that have a commitment to sharing intelligence to ensure that we all maintain national security and therefore international security. So all of these components are absolutely critical for us to ensure that we're able to fulfill our policing responsibilities right from a local level to a national level to an international level.
And has the need, for that sort of integration from the international level to the local level, is that something that you think has changed over your 34 years of policing as our communities become more globalized?
It definitely has changed. And I have to be careful with saying that because 34 years ago, I would have been in my public order tactical kit, standing on the line, taking direction from the command that was planning, doing all the planning, and providing all the direction. So I certainly didn't have an opportunity to be seeing it from this level and through this lens. But in my now almost 20 years of being in a leadership role within policing, I think it is unprecedented.
Mhm,
And there's a lot of reasons for that. We have leveraged technology. The world has become
mhm,
so much smaller from a good standpoint, as well as from those aspects that challenge us.
mhm.
And we have police leaders that really don't see jurisdictional boundaries. They see what is their responsibility and what's required to fulfill those responsibilities.
And that's comforting to know, especially when we're dealing with, geopolitical issues that are having national consequences that are impacting various jurisdictions. And one thing that I've always been curious of is, are you training law enforcement within the OPP in how to handle, these sensitive issues, these geopolitical issues where they might have to interact with, individuals from both sides of the opinion? Is there any special training that your officers receive in order to de-escalate situations?
Well, definitely. We provide our officers with training, from hate crime training at the Ontario Police College to training on how to manage public order events, how to de-escalate conflict between parties. And one of the things that we always have to stress is our job is not to take sides in these types of events where we've got a public demonstration. Our job is to maintain law, to maintain order, and to ensure that the rights and freedoms that are guaranteed under the charter are upheld to the best of our ability. What we do always strive to do is make sure that officers are informed. So when we have certain accelerators that are bringing these conflicts to our local communities, ensuring that to the best of our ability, our officers have an understanding of the emotion that's involved, the history that has brought these events to our doorstep, so they can have an understanding, they can have an appreciation, they can be compassionate, and they can be empathetic, but they can also understand the risks associated to all that is behind the scenes.
That's awesome. And so now we've been talking a little bit about geopolitical issues, and a lot of individuals within our society become informed about these geopolitical issues um, when they're at university, when they're at a post-secondary institution. Um, have you seen discourse that's uh, beginning on campuses? Have you seen that being reflected in the streets and some of the protests that your force has been dealing with?
We definitely do see that. And, that's nothing new. If we actually look back over history, we can go back to the 13th century, and we saw students, protesting through the form of strikes and hunger strikes, right through to, 1965 with the SDS March on Washington, and in the 60s and the 70s, the protest against the Vietnam War, right here on Canadian soil in 1963 to 1970 with the FLQ, who we all know was a left-wing terrorist entity. And in fact, between 1963 and 1970, there were 160 violent incidents, including bombings, kidnappings, murder. And we had 1,000 University of Montreal students sign a petition supporting the FLQ manifesto. So learning institutions have always been an echo chamber for the growth of civil unrest, where it comes in many different forms, and it provides that opportunity on a positive side for critical thought. But it also lends itself to young minds who can be influenced, find common bonds with each other, especially if they feel as though they have been mistreated, or they have a responsibility to stand up for the mistreatment of others. This is where we start to get into the challenges that then play themselves out in unlawful assemblies, in acts of violence.
And does the force take a unique approach to university students in how you interact with members of that cohort?
I don't know that we take a unique approach. I think, the uniqueness of policing here in Ontario as it relates to trying to build trusting, collaborative, and informative relationships with youth. start in the early ages of education. And I'll use York Regional Police as an example. They are providing education from kindergarten right through to high school. They have developed a human rights classroom at their community safety village in Stouffville to inform students about the atrocities of the past and their responsibilities for the future. There's not a lot of intersection between police and university students from an education or information sharing standpoint through the institutions. We really focus our efforts on providing that foundation ahead of time. And one of the key components that we do try to maintain is by creating volunteer opportunities and employment opportunities for university students, which seems small, but I think it is something that policing does in a meaningful way. And three examples that we have here at the Ontario Provincial Police is a cadet program. So we have a program where young people are continuing their education through a post-secondary institution. We'll hire them as a cadet with our police service. So they're employed full-time or part-time while they go to school full-time or part-time. We have many university students who are in our auxiliary policing program or are community volunteers or are engaged through summer employment. So whether it's athletic teams that we're coaching or try to intersect with through community events or employment opportunities, these are some of the positive ways that we find we're able to connect with university students.
And maybe because I know that it played such an integral role in your career path, maybe you could just talk with us about the auxiliary program a little bit more, because I don't think that it gets discussed enough. In your view, could the auxiliary program play a role in sort of this releasing some of the tension that we're seeing in society, maybe helping to connect with some of the community groups that are involved in the present division?
I think they certainly have a role to play in building trust and confidence within communities. We have auxiliary members of all faiths, of all ethnic origins, right across this province. Their presence within their own community as being trusted, as seen as legitimate, as building confidence, is also being able to identify problemed individuals or groups forming within community. They definitely have a role to play.
And just to circle back now to the campuses, what's the relationship? Maybe you could touch a bit upon the relationship between the OPP and the universities themselves, as our universities have been somewhat strained by some of the more problematic events, such as encampments that have occurred on campuses over the past academic year.
Yes, we were not challenged with any university campuses within the municipal jurisdictions that we police. So we are in 329 municipalities as the police service of jurisdiction across this province. And we did not deal with any encampments within those municipalities. However, we certainly are integrated with our other policing partners who did, but those primary points of contacts and those relationships were not something that was managed by the OPP. My own personal observation is where police services have been the most successful is when there is integration between university management, the security services on campus, and the police service of jurisdiction. There's information sharing back and forth, and there are early decisions made about how they're going to deal with these encampments. The quicker that they can come together and establish an action plan and mechanism of moving forward, the more effective they have been in dealing with the encampments.
And given that your jurisdiction includes hundreds of municipalities, would you say that sentiment is echoed in terms of how your force is able to respond to various protests in various different jurisdictions, various different municipalities?
So I would hope it is. We are somewhat we're not unique any longer, but we certainly are one of the I think founding driving forces behind what is called, the police liaison program. We call it PLT, our police liaison team. And that comes out of the Ipperwash inquiry. And essentially, it is about establishing relationships, meaningful relationships in community, being able to have open, honest dialogue often, but at critical times, and constantly focusing on de-escalation, finding solutions to issues that avoid having to move to enforcement whenever possible. And PLT for us is a very effective mechanism for ensuring that we are able to maintain peace, will also allow people to exercise their rights to assemble and express themselves.
Since you brought up Ipperwash, I think that it's important, and you've obviously demonstrated during this discussion, that you're a student of history for us to look at the history of policing, and I think that it helps us to better appreciate where we are in the present. So looking back, at Ipperwash and perhaps some of the failings of police to de-escalate situations effectively in the past, would you say over the course of your experiences as a leader within the police force that we've learned positively from our mistakes? Could you maybe provide some of the positive changes that you've seen in addition to the PLT, or go into some detail?
I think we are an industry that is very good at learning from the past. Absolutely. All of our operations follow either in what we call an after action review or a full debriefing. And that's done internally. In some cases, it's done internally, and there's documents that guide us forward in terms of, what didn't go well and where we need to improve. And in my experience, that has always been embraced. One of the most significant ones we've already touched on are the PLTs, the police liaison teams. Certainly coming out of the G20, there is a lot more clarity in terms of the roles and responsibilities between police chief and civilian oversight, the governing boards that are responsible for the administration of policing services and what information should and needs to be shared. That was certainly a positive evolution of those relationships. As we come out of as we came out of COVID-19, the ability for police services now right across this country to integrate their public order units and think, outside of their own jurisdictions, to look across multi-jurisdictions to see what is and what will impact each other's jurisdictions by decisions we make and actions that we take, and how we can work more collaboratively to ensure that we're mitigating those risks together and not just pushing them from one spot to the next.
And so now I'm gonna before I pivot back to the chat, I think you prompted one more last question for me. Then I will take a look for our audience's knowledge into the chat and see what would bring further relevance to our discussion. But when talking about police liaison officers, you sort of in the G20, you sort of sparked a question for me about the changing nature of intelligence gathering. How has intelligence gathering when it comes to protests and things like that changed over the last few years as these protests have taken on more of a geopolitical and even sometimes an academic ideological scope?
So we actually lead an intelligence initiative on behalf of our policing partners right across Canada, and we are regularly disseminating intelligence bulletins at a minimum on a weekly basis, routine, just keeping all of the policing partners up to date is what's happening globally, what's happening nationally, what's happening locally. We increase the cadence of that reporting based on need. So at a minimum, those reports will go out weekly. We may disseminate multiple reports in a day. We have the flexibility, we have the connectivity to even do briefings by the minute, by the hour, by the week, to bring intelligence groups and our law enforcement entities all together under the umbrella of sharing the information, sharing the intelligence to inform the planning process and to ensure that the collaboration, the necessary collaboration, is in place for our success.
In addition to, the ability to exercise that, a few questions that we've seen in the chat have been talking about resources. As as the needs of the community continue to change, do we have enough police officers? Do we have the sufficient physical resources to manage all these protests? I mean, you're responsible for hundreds of municipalities across thousands of kilometers. Have recent events put a strain on your physical resources, Commissioner?
Recent events over the last number of years have absolutely put a strain on police resources right across this country. No police service was ever built or designed to be responding to the number of protests that we are seeing, not only in frequency, but magnitude. Appreciating that for most police services, every public order officer that is standing out on our streets, keeping our community safe, is an officer taken away from another responsibility. These are not full-time units. These are not full-time jobs. They're not full-time responsibilities. They are highly trained, highly experienced, very dedicated, competent, capable officers. But every time we have to deploy a member of public order in most police services, they're taken away from other responsibilities. So it has been an enormous drain and an enormous strain on policing right across this country. It's costing tens of millions of dollars in our major jurisdictions. We've been very fortunate as the OPP. We have been provided with some additional resources to be able to respond to the increase in demonstrations and to lend assistance to other services, which, depending on any moment in time, we can have any one of our public order units from Northern Ontario to Ottawa to Windsor to Toronto, Kingston, London, Waterloo, and that's a service that we are able to provide. But we really do need community support for police services right across this country to ensure that they are staffed appropriately.
And just in terms of community support, someone has posted in the chat, and this is a very good comment. If somebody wants to, connect with the OPP through social media, does the OPP monitor its handles like OPP News, things like that? Are you aware?
Yes, they do. We have strategic communication professionals who monitor our social media accounts. Obviously, I would suggest if it's something emergent, 911 is obviously the best point of contact. Or, a lot of times, if you're able to go on the website, if there's a particular area of the organization you'd like to connect with, there are numerous email accounts identified there. And that's probably the best and most reliable way to be reaching out to us.
In terms of community engagement in liaison, the liaison teams specifically, I've had a couple of questions in the chat about the public school liaison teams, and there seems to be a misunderstanding. Are those teams through the OPP still in existence?
So we do have school resource officers that are still working in or with schools around the province. We did see a downturn in some municipalities some time ago with the willingness to continue with that program. The vast majority of the areas that we police in, we have maintained that presence and those relationships. But that's not the same right across the province. It's not the same right across the country. And those are critical roles and relationships that we talked about earlier that can lead to young people becoming responsible contributors to society. It creates safer schools simply by having uniformed presence engaged there on a regular basis. There are so many advantages to it, not diminishing that there can be negative impacts and implications for individual students or groups of students who have had negative experiences with police, a lot of times outside of Canada, but sometimes within our own country as well.
And I'll get back to the chat in just a second if people are continuing to post in it. But you sparked a new question for me, Commissioner Carrique. I know that your force has worked, and I know that forces across the country have worked diligently to, to reaffirm the public's trust and confidence in police forces, to enable the continued existence of programs like the liaison officers, etc. How have recent events complicated, your abilities to reaffirm the public's trust when there's just so much division and sometimes so much animosity projected at our forces?
I think for the most part, it's based on the fact that a lot of the relationships were pre-existing. And that is so critical. The time of crisis is not when we want to be exchanging contact information or introducing or meeting each other for the very first time. So there has been, many occasions where we've had to get together with community groups, community leaders, to talk through conflict and to try to rebuild trust and rebuild confidence. But I'm very satisfied and very proud of our service and how I feel we have been able to maintain that through very trying times.
Yeah, it sounds like in a lot of ways, a lot of the hard work that you were doing before sort of some of the unrest has better equipped your force to handle that. So, as we say in Hebrew, kol hakavod to you for that, and we really do appreciate all the efforts that you've done. Certainly, to continue to work with the Jewish community and other communities during these more difficult times. When it comes to enforcing the law, there's a bit of a technical question that's popped up in the chat. So if you don't have the perfect answer to it, that's fine. But it has to do with, sort of the lawful parameters of protests. And I think that it's important because I think a lot of people are confused. Is it lawful for there to be protests occurring on overpasses on provincial highways? That's part one of it. And if you're able to provide an answer to that, Commissioner, I think a lot of people in the discussion would be grateful.
Yes, and there's not a very simple answer to it because it depends on what activity is happening on an overpass and where that overpass is and what interference that demonstration or protest may be causing. There's nothing preventing people from standing on a sidewalk of an overpass along the 400. But if they're obstructing traffic or they're creating a danger for the traffic passing underneath the overpass, that totally can change the dynamic, and what could have been legal can become illegal. There are overpasses where the crowd is causing a disturbance. They're inciting fear. These are also implications that can cause what would have been a lawful gathering to become unlawful. So there's not a direct yes, no answer to it. It all depends on the circumstances.
No, and I think that it puts your forces oftentimes in a very difficult position when trying to, to determine when something has crossed the line, when the threshold is so ambiguous. The next question, similar in nature, relates to, I know that I don't believe this has happened within your jurisdiction, at least not during the present anti-Israel protests, but there might have been some instances of it during previous times of civic unrest. The question is, why did the police not step in when a flag is being burned? And I just was wondering if you could maybe clarify for the audience why that is the case. I believe that the question is specifically referring to the Canadian flag.
Yes, we haven't, can't think of a time in my time here where we've dealt with this within our own jurisdiction. So I certainly would not want to say something that would speak to an incident that happened in another jurisdiction. There are, whether it's the burning of a flag or whether it's, other acts that would constitute a criminal offense. Sometimes it can be more dangerous to those participating, counter groups, and police to take immediate action. A lot of times there's evidence collected and gathered, and charges are laid at a subsequent time or date. So I think one thing that is really important to recognize and realize is where there may be an offense that somebody observes being committed, or an offense that appears to have been committed, that's where some of the trust and confidence can be leaned upon, that police are following up on incidents, and where there is evidence, and they are able to identify perpetrators, they are laying charges. That changes if there's a risk to somebody's physical safety. Obviously, an intervention would take place right away. But when it's damage to property, a lot of times the best tactic, the safest tactic, is to collect the evidence that you need and subsequently make the arrest and lay the charge.
And speaking of evidence collection, that segues into another very good question from our chat. The public order units, they're obviously very highly trained. Are they trained in the nuances of some of these protests to be able to identify perhaps problematic chants or problematic phrases that might be dog whistles for hatred or for other criminal offenses?
They are when known. I think what we find out is as things generate more energy and more hatred, police are not always able to keep up to speed with terminology, words, phrases that would constitute hate. They're not experts in hate. They are public order officers, which we try to ensure have an understanding, but we will always have in large protests other means of identifying and collecting that evidence over and above the public order officers who are there to provide physical protection, to protect property, to protect people. There are investigative entities and components that happen in parallel over and above.
So it would be fair to say that there's integration between the public order units who are physically maintaining the peace and perhaps the hate crimes units and others that are doing sort of the more nuanced follow-up investigation.
That would be a very fair way of stating it. Yes, thank you.
And another question that's come up a few times is the language training of the OPP. Obviously, you deal with a very large physical jurisdiction, but also a very multicultural jurisdiction filled with individuals from different cultures. How is the force able to handle the multiplicity of languages that it has to interact with when investigating crimes?
Through translation services, if we do not have an officer on duty or a civilian member that speaks the language that we need to have that interaction at that point in time, we rely on translation services. We have a large number of languages spoken across the organization. We do keep track of who speaks, writes, and reads what languages, but we're not always guaranteed that we will have somebody either employed or on duty at the time that that language skill is needed.
And just one more technical question that's popped up, and I think it's important for our audience to know this. Do you differentiate between permitted protests and unpermitted protests when managing these protests?
So
permitted as in like physically a protest that's required a permit is, I believe, what the audience member is asking.
We typically do not deal in permitted or unpermitted protests. Where we would get involved in those nuances are if somebody is trespassing on private property or violating a trespass to property act, have been issued with a trespass notice through the lawful owner or occupier of the property. There are specific locations that issue permits. But if someone was not a permit holder, then they would be trespassing, and we would be relying on trespass legislation as opposed to the power of a permit.
And we're almost out of time here, Commissioner, but I wanted to maybe turn our attention towards the future. What sort of lessons do you think the police force will take away from this, this period of protests that we've seen? I know that it seems like there were a lot of positive changes that have come out of things like the G20. You already talked about Ipperwash. You talked about the Freedom Convoy a little bit and some of the positive police work that emerged out of that. Do you see any positives that have come out of the recent spate of protests? Do you see there is even the potential for there to be positives for your force?
I think the positives for policing overall have been a real understanding of how these global events dramatically impact people in our communities, in the Jewish community in particular, when we have fellow officers who say to us, I'm afraid. I'm afraid in my own community. I'm afraid for my children to play out in front of my house. I'm afraid to go to my synagogue. Those realizations for our officers, I think, are life-changing. And I think the effort in particular from Chief Myron Dempkew in Toronto, Fatty Degar in Montreal, Adam Palmer in Vancouver, where they have spent countless hours and days in synagogue, in families' living rooms, communicating, learning, trying to understand and sharing what it is they are trying to accomplish as police leaders, where their authorities lie, and doing their absolute best to maintain communication, understanding, empathy, and hopefully that builds greater trust and confidence in some of the most trying times that we have seen and hopefully will not continue to see. We hope that it just gets better.
Well, I can tell you that after events like tonight, which is a form of community engagement as well, that I personally feel better as a member and a representative of the community. So the work that you're doing, to reaffirm the trust of our community and to show our community your commitment to public safety and order, it hasn't gone unnoticed. I endeavor to end every single one of our SAC-LHR questions, but on a positive note. So we've looked towards the future. Now let's go to a positive note. Commissioner, you've had an illustrious 34-year career in policing that hopefully will continue for many more. What's been the best part of being a police officer? What's your favorite thing, your one favorite thing, if you can summarize for us?
Well, I think my one favorite thing is getting to live out a childhood dream and be in a role that I can assist others in doing the same. And the thing that strives, that energizes me and keeps me going is knowing that I am part of a team that is responsible for the safety and security of Ontario. And that my responsibility is to ensure that my officers feel respected, valued, supported, have the resources they need to fulfill their mission to serve and protect our province.
Well, I couldn't think of a better leader after that. So thank you so much for the leadership that you play within the province on a daily basis. I think I can speak for everyone by letting you know that you're leaving us with the impression that our police force in the province is in excellent hands. And I thank you so much for taking the time to speak with me tonight, Commissioner, and for informing us about these issues and everything that you're doing. Aubrey, I turn it back over to you.
Rich, thank you very much. Commissioner, you are, as I have experienced over all these years working with you, a great leader. And thank you for that unbelievable leadership that you have provided. And this evening, I'd like to thank you for a very informative, sincere, and detailed Zoom and YouTube chat. Your unprecedented support and discussion of facts and truths is refreshing and a path for the future for Canadians, all of whom have come here for a better life for themselves, their children, and future generations. It's been a great evening. Your professionalism and your honesty has been superb. And as a special note for those who are online, part of the Jewish community, I need to mention that this will be the third year under the Commissioner's leadership. The Commissioner's leadership, we're having the menorah, the annual menorah lighting ceremony, which will take place at OPP headquarters, and at the same time expanded to all of the OPP regional headquarters across the province of Ontario. The strong role that a number of people within the Jewish community have played working with you and your staff, your team, has been exceptional. We thank you for that. We thank you for your leadership. And just in closure, a thank you for joining us this evening, everybody, and let us pray for light to overpower darkness during these difficult times. We will see you for our next fireside chat, and good night.